bio that we like to do at the beginning. So Emily graduated from University of Rhode Island. I'm actually unsure on the date, 2016, 2015?
2015.
2015, it's pretty darn close. And then pretty quickly thereafter moved out here, where she formed her own consulting company, where she worked on a variety of projects with some of you in the room, including work on the Hook Canal Bridge, which, if you're not familiar with the Hook Canal Bridge, apparently it's a really well-designed bridge to feed steelhead to seals. And Emily did a lot of work to sort of document some of the problems with other people in the room. And then she joined SAS in 2021. I'll just do a couple highlights from her CV. She's got 5 publications already published, and plus several sort of technical reports, including some of the Canal Bridge stuff. Just a whole bunch of service. I can't really list all of it. A big theme of it is a ton of mentoring. So she's done peer mentoring, she's done undergraduate mentoring, she's done the NSF-GRP mentoring, Holling Scholar mentoring, a lot of mentoring. Also had several positions within FINS, including running the graduate student, what's the fall one called?
Symposium, GSS.
GSS, okay, I combine acronyms. The GSS symposium during a period where there was a lot of changes to the symposium structure at that time. And Emily, I know, played a big role in that. And then also awards. I'm losing my voice. It happens every time I talk about you, Emily. I get so excited. She was a recipient of the NSF GFRP, which is, of course, why she did the NSF GFRP mentoring, and also won the Faculty Merit Award. Woohoo! Yes. I just want to tell one quick anecdote just about when I first met Emily. So Hans, who, wait, Hans. So I've worked with Hans a bit, and Hans and Emily worked a bit. And it was that period of time when people were sort of applying to graduate schools, and Hans had messaged me, he's like, this is great. Potential student should really meet this person. Her name is Emily. She does really great work. And I think like I've got like a lot of projects that would be really, really great that could be and fully funded. And that would be a great sort of gateway into graduate school. So like, great, sounds excellent. So we planned to meet. It was like some morning, it's called a Monday morning at 10. And Monday morning at 10 showed up, and just Emily was there. And I was like, where's Hans? And Emily said, well, I actually asked Hans not to come. Okay. Is there some personal backstory there? No. And Emily explained to me, he's like, well, you know, I went to graduate school to learn new things. And I'm sort of worried that if I kind of like take on projects that are really similar to what I'm currently doing, like I'm not really gonna like learn all the stuff that I want to learn. And I was like, oh, it's pretty impressive. And it turns out that was everything I needed to know about Emily right there. And I think I said during the commencement is, you know, given the choice of like an easy path or like a more difficult but more rewarding, she'll always take that second one. And I think you can see a lot of that in her presentation today. So please join me in welcoming Emily.
Thanks for that introduction, Tim. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining me today to hear about my dissertation work. So when I said that I was going to grad school, a really good friend of mine from when I was a kid was like, that's great, Emily, but don't we already know everything we need to know about fish? Which is a super valid question, especially for coastal fish species, which is what I focus on. And that's in part because people have been interacting with coastal species for as long as people have been around. And we see this reflected in art, in things like place names. And so we've been interacting with coastal species and learning about them for generations. And as long as we've been doing that, humans have also been interacting with and modifying the coastal environment. So building things like fish weirs and clam gardens. Basically, humans have been changing marine coasts for as long as we've been around. And these changes have only accelerated in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so with these changes to the physical habitat itself, there come changes to ecological processes and to the species that are interacting with these coastal modifications. So sometimes we see things like habitat loss if we're placing structures along coasts. We see changes to water quality with urbanization, but we can also see new species coming in and colonizing these habitats and new combinations of species and new processes that unfold. So basically, all of these changes that we're making to coastal ecosystems can add up and ultimately impact the features of marine coasts and the services that humans rely on, like fisheries resources and culturally important species. So to answer Krista's question, no, we don't know everything we need to know about coastal fish. And part of that is because we're constantly changing the game for them and changing the processes that they're taking part in. And so the challenge is, how do we get from all of these changes to coastal ecosystems that humans are enacting to effective management? So this looks like making decisions like, where do we put a new dock? Do we allow this dock to be permitted? Where do we direct restoration efforts if we're going to try to take out some of this infrastructure to help species if there's combinations or processes that we no longer like in the ecosystem? Or we could say, what adjustments can we make to fishing rules to make sure that fisheries are sustainable? So my 4 dissertation chapters are in support of understanding these changes to coastal ecosystems so that we can make better management decisions. So I did this work in the Salish Sea, and the Puget Sound region of the Salish Sea is the Washington state side. And this region is a great model system for learning about changes to coastal habitats because we have really modified shorelines like downtown Seattle. There's also lots of natural shorelines that look beautiful, like this picture. And then even in some of the rural areas, we have shoreline armor, which is a type of shoreline modification that we see in a lot of Puget Sound coastlines. And this is a big one that we talk about in the region because about 30% of shorelines within Puget Sound have some sort of armor. And armor is referring to bulkheads, seawalls, and revetments, things that people install on their shorelines to prevent erosion and preserve their upland area. And so whereas on a natural shoreline without any kind of armor, we have lots of features that benefit subtidal fish, where there's that natural erosion process. And so we have sandy substrate for eelgrass to grow in and for benthic species to prey on invertebrates. There's nice shallow water area for smaller fishes to avoid predators. And there's connectivity for energy to flow from the terrestrial to the marine environment. When we have an armored shoreline, the armor in preventing that erosion process, it creates less beach area because there's less sediment coming from upland. There's wave scour due to changes in wave energy that results in coarser substrate and a steeper slope, so less shallow water area for smaller fish. So we know a lot about how armor is impacting species that live on the beach, particularly insects and invertebrates, but we know less about how those impacts extend into the subtidal environment for marine fishes specifically. So my first 2 chapters focused on the impacts of armor to fish that are occupying water just offshore of that armor. And to explore those associations, we went out and collected a few years of field data. So we collected data about fish from 6 sites around Puget Sound, spanning from Olympia up to the San Juan Islands. And each site contained a shoreline that represented a different type of shoreline condition. So we had shorelines with armor, either a bulkhead or seawall, restored shorelines where there previously was armor, but it's since been removed, and then reference or natural shorelines that have never had any kind of armor. And so at these 3 shoreline types that comprise each of our 6 sites, we used a Lampara net, which is a modified beach seine. It's basically a net that you sample fish in surface waters just offshore of the beach. We sampled fish and we identified everyone that we collected and looked at the abundances of each species. So now comes the challenge of associating what we caught in our net with what was happening on the shoreline. And this is what I tackled in my first chapter. So in this chapter, we found that nearshore fish abundance does vary weekly with armor extent. And we published this chapter in 2024. So preliminary analyses of this data set showed that there was some weak and variable association between fish presence, so certain species of fish, with our three shoreline types, armor, natural, restored. And so given that there was this weak association, we were wondering, are we looking at the right spatial scale? Are fish just responding to armor that is present within a small section of shoreline? And our shorelines were about 30 meters long, so not super long. So do they care about that 30-meter segment, or do they care more about how much armor is within the bay or how much armor is within the region? So in this case, we're asking, what happens if you have a little bit of armor next to a lot of armor? Does that change the story, and does that mean that fish are responding more to what's happening on the shoreline? And so the fish species that we looked at for this chapter, we called our two forage fish species, herring and smelt, resident, because they are swimming around Puget Sound. They do spawn on the beach during part of their life cycle, but otherwise they're just kind of hanging out, responding to other things. And then we looked at two species of salmon, which we called our migratory species. And salmon, they hatch as eggs in stream, and then they migrate through Puget Sound on their way to the ocean. So these are juvenile salmon that are on their migration at the time that we were capturing them. So we were curious if these two sort of ways that fish might respond to the beach are different between these two life histories. And our driving questions for this work were, are fish avoiding armored shorelines? Does this pattern change if we look at the amount of armor at different spatial scales? So the context of our shoreline segments. And then how does life history play a role in shaping these patterns? So we use generalized linear mixed models to relate the number of individuals we caught of these species to different factors that we thought might influence their presence in the nearshore. So we included several of these factors in our models, but the main one I want to highlight is the one in the second row, which is that surrounding armor piece that we were really curious about. But the question is, what amount of surrounding armor do we include in our model? Do we include every possible increment of armor, going for every foot out from our shoreline segments? That would have been an infinite number of models and taken way too long, and I'm trying to graduate. So instead, we adopted a two-phase approach. In the first one, we just looked at three levels of surrounding armor. So basically saying, what if we just started with small, medium, and large spatial extents, and we used a model selection process to evaluate the evidence for those models. Then we included the second step, which asked, would we have seen a different effect if we had included more spatial scales in that first step? So basically seeing if there was a stronger effect with more comparisons. And so I want to orient you to the way that we're going to look at the results here. So we have all the different spatial scales that we looked at on the x-axis, and then the effect size on the y-axis. So if there's no effect, it's going to be around 0, or it could be a positive or negative effect of armor on fish abundance. And we looked at just two species that I'll share here because results are pretty similar for the other forage fish and other salmon species. So first, looking at the effect for Chinook salmon. The best fitting model found that there was this slight positive effect of armor at a small scale. So this was contrary to what we expected to find. We thought that salmon would hate armor, but we actually found a slightly more Chinook near armored shorelines. And then in our second step, we're asking, do they care about different scales? Would we have seen a different effect if we had looked at more? What do you guys think? So weak positive at small scales, the error bars are overlapping 0 at larger scales. And so that means that we're still seeing that weak positive effect at small scales. Our answer hasn't changed with this confirmation step. So now let's see if the other life history had a different response. we're looking at herring. And here we're seeing a slight negative effect at a slightly larger spatial scale. And this is another weak association, but it's more in line with what we had predicted the response to be. And if we look at our second confirmation step to see if our results have changed, we're seeing a similar response where we see this weak negative effect at larger spatial scales. So our conclusions for this first chapter were that some species do avoid regions with more armor, the herring in particular, but we saw the opposite effect for salmon. They actually were, you could say, attracted to armor at smaller spatial scales. We did see that spatial scale mattered in terms of whether we were seeing a response for both of these types of species. And we're thinking that life history is likely to play a bigger role in where fish are found than the armor itself, because we did see these just weak responses. And for example, salmon are on their migration out of Puget Sound during this time. And if we had seen a stronger response, we would think that they care a lot about shoreline armor in this case, but because we didn't, we think there's just other factors playing a role in where they are in the shoreline. And so our major takeaway is that fish response to armor is variable and context dependent. It depends on the life history of the species and how much armor is surrounding your shoreline that you're looking at. So this adds nuance to the armor is bad conversation that we hear in conversations about restoration in the region, and really tells us that we want to think a little bit more about the context of if we need to remove armor from a given shoreline. So what about the rest of the community that we caught in our net samples? We caught all sorts of cool fish, not just herring and Chinook. And so seeing this variety of species and knowing that life history plays a role in response, we were curious how the community overall responds to shoreline armor presence. And this is what I focused on in my second chapter. So in this chapter, I evaluated the functional diversity of the communities in front of shoreline armor. So when we're thinking about diversity, often the classic one is species diversity. So that's asking who is present. This is a common metric that we use to evaluate restoration and impacts of coastal infrastructure. And so we might say how many species are present at a shoreline. Functional diversity gives a little more nuanced look at that conversation. So it's asking what traits are represented by the fish present. And so by traits, I mean biological characterizations, or basically what resources a fish is using, what parts of the habitat do they care about. So these are different traits popping up on the screen, like body size and feeding guild. So it just tells you more about how fish are interacting with each other and the environment if you look at functional diversity. And so we have some evidence from the literature that armor presence affects groups with different functional traits differently. So if we have a coarser sediment structure, then we might expect to see fewer bottom-associated fishes that really depend on sandy substrate for feeding. If we have less shallow water area, then we might see fewer individuals that have a smaller body size because they like that area to avoid predators. And then we also might see changes in the types of food that fish eat if they're present at armored shorelines based on whether there's aquatic vegetation. So given that there's this evidence that we might see a response in functional traits to shoreline armor, for this chapter, I asked, how does the diversity of these traits, or the functional diversity of fish, vary between the shoreline types that we sampled? And then, echoing a theme from chapter 1, I asked, okay, if we don't see a strong response at just that shoreline segment scale, what if we zoom out and ask at the site level, is there a difference in functional diversity between these sites that spanned all of Puget Sound? And so the results that I'll show for these data, we're going to have either site or our 3 shoreline types on the x-axis. And then the y-axis is going to be different metrics of functional diversity. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can describe how these traits are represented in the assemblage. The first one is functional richness. So this asks how many different types of fish are present, or what's the representation of different traits that we see in our assemblage. And so here we have our 3 shoreline types on the x-axis and functional richness on the y-axis. And the boxes are showing the spread of data. So if the data are overlapping between shoreline conditions, that means that they're not that different from each other. And that's what we're seeing here, is that there was no significant difference in functional richness between our shoreline types. When we looked at the site scale, combining our shoreline types and looking across Puget Sound, we saw that most sites were similar, but there was one that really stood out, and this is Cornet Bay, which is a very commonly sampled site in this region. And what we found is that this result makes a lot of sense. Cornet Bay is pretty centrally located. It's on basically a migration highway for salmon, and it basically had all of the fish represented that we caught at our other sites. So it wasn't that it had unique species, it just had all the species that we saw elsewhere. So then we asked about functional evenness, which is a metric of functional diversity that asks whether we see similar abundances of each trait present. So do you see a bunch of fish that eat plankton hanging out at the top of the water column, or do you see more flatfish hanging out at the bottom of the water column? And that's true for other traits. So we're comparing how well each trait is represented. And so we see a similar result for functional evenness. There was no difference between our 3 shoreline conditions. And then there was a little bit of difference between a couple of our northern sites and one southern site. So it's very weakly positive effect. Basically, this is just related to spatial variability between how far apart those sites are. And so our last metric of functional diversity asks, how unique are the most common fish? So do you have a site where there's a bunch of these bay pipefish, which are fun little seahorse-related fishes that are super unique? Are you seeing a bunch of unique fish in that area, or are you seeing a bunch of salmon that are sort of an average body type? And so again, we did not see any difference between our 3 shoreline conditions. And we also didn't see any differences between sites, although we did generally see high functional divergence across all of our sites. So this is saying that each site has some cool, unique species present. So in conclusion, for this chapter, we did not see any difference in functional diversity between our small shoreline segments that had different conditions, armored, natural, or restored. We saw some differences among sites for some metrics, but they weren't related to any broader spatial patterns that we could untangle. There's just a lot of variability in this region. And so overall, building on our first chapter, we're learning that armor is an incomplete predictor of habitat quality. So if you're planning to do a project where you're doing restoration, you might not expect to see a difference in functional diversity at a really small scale. But I think that these metrics have potential to tell us a lot about the overall community at broader scales. So this first couple chapters have told us that life history and spatial context play a big role in where we find fishes and what their diversity is. And so if we're not seeing a super strong response of nearshore fish to features of the shorelines, how much information do we have to make management decisions of where do we conduct restoration for species that we care about? A lot of restoration in this region focuses on salmon because it's a culturally significant species and the early marine phase is a survival bottleneck. But we saw in the first couple of chapters that they're not responding predictably to shoreline armor. So the question then becomes, what are they responding to? And this is what I focused on in my third chapter. And Chinook salmon, the wild salmon, are endangered in Puget Sound. And if you were on the water at all in the past couple days and saw the recreational fishery that was out over the weekend, you would see that it's a really popular and significant fishery in this region. So it's important to know where we can direct our efforts to help their survival. So for this chapter, I conducted a literature review, evaluating evidence available to make decisions about where to do restoration and conservation for the species in the marine nearshore. So our driving questions for this work was, how much do we know about the associations between habitat features and juvenile Chinook survival? And this is specifically for the marine nearshore. So after they've left their estuary and they're on their migration through Puget Sound out to the ocean. And then I focus specifically on factors that directly might influence their growth and survival. So no indirect pathways, but just specifically papers that looked at evidence that said, does this feature of nearshore habitat help salmon make it through on their migration? And so I focused on a few focal categories of nearshore habitat. These are ones that often come up in conversations about whether to restore a given shoreline. And so I looked at depth and substrate, kelp and eelgrass, shoreline armor, and overwater structure. So these are common things that you might either think about restoring a shoreline by removing overwater structure and armor, and maybe in that restoration, you're planting eelgrass or making the depth a certain depth. And so I looked at evidence in the literature for associations between Chinook and these shoreline features. And what I found is that I have a green arrow here for positive effective depth, but essentially Chinook salmon will distribute based on their body size. So like I've been saying, smaller individuals like shallower water, and then as they grow, they're moving offshore. So we do see a pretty strong linkage between depth and Chinook. But for these other factors, the evidence in the literature for substrate was basically papers showing that they are present at different substrates. So there wasn't necessarily a causal link. It was just, we do see them at lots of different substrate types. For kelp and eelgrass, there was a mix of positive and actually negative associations. And so the conclusion for that is just, there's not a strong association where we can say it either is a benefit or a negative. And similarly for shoreline armor, there were papers that showed a positive link, like my first chapter, and ones that showed a negative link. And actually the paper that showed the strongest negative link, it was because the armor was truncating the shallow water habitat. So it was really more about the depth availability. And finally, for overwater structure, that's the type of infrastructure that we really see more negative effects in terms of Chinook are avoiding that structure as they're migrating through. So it means they have a longer migration path. We see fewer feeding behaviors under piers and docks. And so there was a stronger association there than these other features. So the conclusion for this work is that there was actually weak evidence that a lot of shoreline habitat features are directly influencing Chinook salmon growth and survival. And part of this was because many of the papers that are available are looking at where they're found. Are they present in a habitat? Or how many there are, and not actually directly measuring growth and survival. So I think there's opportunities to do more work in the nearshore measuring these things. And so in conclusion for this chapter, in terms of Chinook salmon links to habitat, so far the evidence has been pretty weak, except for a few specific examples like overwater structures. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't do restoration for the species. I think it just means that we can temper our expectations about the effect of smaller projects. And then we can focus more maybe on processes that we know are more directly linked to shoreline armor and restore those processes. And I bet you there's an indirect benefit to salmon through doing that. So now we're going to transition into a totally different species, Dungeness crab. So this is another extremely economically important species in the region. And the commercial fishery for crab catches 7 to 9 million pounds every year. So hugely influential in the region, and there's a big cultural value. So another species where there's a lot of motivation to make sure we're sustainably managing this resource. And so versus my earlier chapters where we were building ecological knowledge, this chapter is moving towards how do we use the knowledge that we have to start informing decision-making processes. So again, this is a really valuable fishery in this region, and it's been managed sustainably for many years. But recent declines in some areas of Puget Sound have raised questions about the continued sustainability of the fishery. So up until now, I've been focusing on the impacts of shoreline modifications to coastal species in Puget Sound. But crab face not only those stressors, but also stressors related to climate change, like changing temperatures, ocean acidification, shipping traffic might cause oil spills. So there's a lot that we could potentially be worried about for the species in this region. But it's hard to know what's going on with this fishery because there's not a unified population assessment or survey across the whole sound. So we have limited information to assess how well management is operating and how robust it might be to increase stressors going into the future. And so the current management system for the species in this area is that the fisheries are co-managed by the state of Washington and Puget Sound Treaty Tribes, where harvest is split equally between the state and all the tribal fisheries. And then they're collectively managed by having control limits on size, sex, and season. So we often call this the 3S system, where we're limiting the crab that you can take home based on its size. So it has to be 6¼ inches. Sex, it has to be a male. And season, where the fishing seasons are set to avoid the male molt period, because crabs are more vulnerable after they've recently molted. They have soft shells. And so they're not as commercially viable because they don't hold up well to get to the restaurant. They kind of fall apart. And they also have higher mortality if you catch them and they're soft and then throw them back. So our driving question for this chapter is how robust is the current management structure to these stressors in the ecosystem, with those stressors being identified by people involved in management of the fishery. So to answer this question, first we had to understand what those priority stressors or threats are. And I did that by conducting interviews with people who work at governments involved in fishery co-management. And then I used those interviews to inform a modeling exercise where I incorporated their feedback into building a statistical model. And then I tested model performance under ranges of the threats that they identified. And then I compared some alternatives to management, basically saying if we did things a little bit differently, would there be a more positive result on fishery performance in the face of these threats? So the interview takeaways for the threats faced by this fishery included 3 main ones. So while we talked about a lot of novel threats related to climate change, like increasing temperatures and ocean acidification, there were so many question marks involved with how those stressors will actually affect the population that it was basically not going to be viable to build into a model. But there were stressors that are already happening and maybe are getting a little bit worse currently. And so those are the threats that we focused on incorporating. So the first one was illegal harvest, where you take home females or males that are not large enough to be legally brought home. The second one was handling injury. So this is where you catch a pot full of crab and you're only allowed to keep a certain number, so you throw the rest back. We actually do see mortality associated with crabs being tossed overboard. And so there was this question of, are those effects adding up to actually affecting the population? And then the last one was related to lost fishing gear, also known as derelict gear, where if you put a pot in the water and then it's lost in high currents, or maybe you didn't have a long enough line and it went underwater and you couldn't find it when you went back to retrieve it, those pots can continue to fish over time, and crabs that scuttle into them might have mortality because they're eaten by other crabs in the pot, or they starve because they can't get out. So we have these three threats that we now want to incorporate into the statistical model to explore. And so I built them into an existing age and stage structured population model that was built by a former student of Tim's, Holly Froelich. And so in an age and stage structured model, we're essentially tracking the growth of cohorts of crab over time. So we modeled females and males separately, and then at each step in the model, some portion are growing and continuing out their life cycle until they eventually die after 10 years. But other crab experience mortality, and that could just be from natural sources. Maybe it got eaten by a seagull, or once crab are big enough to be caught in pots, then we're including mortality from fisheries and derelict gear and these other threats. So for each of these stages where we're incorporating mortality, we added in the threats identified in interviews by, so for illegal harvest, we said that some portion of the smaller males that are big enough to be caught in a pot, but not big enough to be taken home legally, those, some are retained as illegal catch, and females that are captured in a pot, some portion of those are retained as illegal catch. We also said that the probability of someone taking home a sublegal male or a female increases if the catch of legal males decreases. So if you didn't catch enough legal crab for dinner, maybe you're going to take home a female to supplement. For the handling injury threat, we said that there's a higher mortality rate when crabs are soft. So we included a piece of the model where we said some portion of the population is soft at all times. And those crab are going to have higher mortality if they're caught in the trap. And we also said that you can't legally keep those crab. So that mirrors what we see in the real fishery where it's illegal to take home a soft crab. And for our third threat, the lost fishing gear, we said that for each month where we have a fishery open in this model, some proportion of pots are going to be lost in the system, and those are accumulating over time. And not only are they accumulating over time, they're decaying over time. So after about 7 years, they're not really fishing anymore. They kind of break down and lose their ability to fish. So there's an increase, and then they kind of break down. And then we also said that some pots are removed every year. And this is because the treaty tribes and the state will do gear sweeps to try to limit lost gear. And they will also hire ROVs to go find lost gear. So we wanted to reflect that process, that there are these efforts to remove gear, and see how effective those efforts might be. So we incorporated this all into the population model, which if you think this looks crazy, you should see the math behind all of it. And we have our threats highlighted in yellow. And so to run this model, we're basically starting with a certain number of crab and then saying, what happens if you watch the population go over 150 years? What do things look like when you've reached equilibrium conditions? And so for all of these threats, if we're saying some portion are taken for illegal harvest, some portion are dying from handling mortality, what does that actually mean? So for each of our threat levels, the model is set up so that we can evaluate different levels of them. So we looked at low threat levels up to high threat levels to see the impact. And our metric for evaluating the impact here was just legal catch. So if we saw that a given threat impacted catch, we would expect to see a sloped line where basically catch is changing based on the threat level. If there's no association, we would expect to see a flat line because whatever the range of threat is, it doesn't change catch. So here, looking at the results, When we looked at the probability of illegal take, we see a slight negative relationship. So it's validating concern about this threat under these model conditions. And it tells us that if you're really hammering your sublegal males and females, taking them out of the population, you do ultimately see lower catch overall, that the population is impacted. Conversely, we saw less of an effect with handling mortality. That line is more straight across, depending on the threat level. So even though sublegal males and females are impacted by handling, it's not really enough to affect fishery performance overall. But if we just looked at shell hardness, that parameter that impacts both the handling mortality and whether you can take home a crab, we see a much stronger response. So this is saying that the shell hardness parameter means more for removal of the legal males to the system. There's that direct relationship between how many legal males there are and how many you can catch. So that's where that parameter really shines. And then we also saw a relationship with mortality rate and lost gear. So any crab that can be caught in a pot is then removed from the system in this scenario. So this is another one that is directly impacting the number of legal size males in the system, not just sublegal males and females. So that's really why that parameter has an effect. And then, as you would expect, if you remove lost gear, you're going to have an increase in catch. So then we also asked, what happens if you have low productivity, which is essentially to say, what if there are just fewer crabs in the system? Do these stressors become more severe? So if we saw a negative relationship at status quo or baseline productivity, maybe you'd expect to see a stronger relationship under low productivity conditions because the system is really stressed out and things are just worse if you have these threats. And what we found actually was the opposite, was that under low productivity scenarios for threats where we saw that relationship, it kind of just flattened out and you had lower catch overall. And I think that this is because if you have lower productivity, you're catching fewer crab. And so you have less fishery openers, which means you're losing less gear and you have lower chances of people being tempted to take home those sublegal males and females. So again, we also saw this with mortality rate and lost gear. If there's less fishery openers, there's less gear being lost. And so there's less of an impact of this threat under the low productivity conditions. So then we also wanted to know, what if we made tweaks in management, not necessarily because these would happen, but just as a thought exercise, what if management looked a little bit different? What would be the outcome? And so in this scenario, we removed catch limits, where in the real world, there's a total catch limit that the state and tribes adhere to. So if we just remove that and say, catch all the crab you want, what happens to our fishery outcomes? And we found that catch didn't really change actually, but what you had is fishery openers that were only at the beginning of the year, and then fewer opportunities to fish through the rest of the year. So because the fishery isn't limited when you've exceeded an amount, it just keeps going, then there's less crab to catch in December. Then we asked what happens if you close fishing when catch is low, basically to say, we don't want handling mortality by continuing to fish on a system where there's no legal males left. So we'll just say, everyone stay home. We'll wait until next year when there's more large males. And what we found there is that if you close the fishery, then there will be less catch. But at the end of the year, you do have legal males left in the system, which was something that some respondents in interviews said was important to them. They didn't actually want to be removing all the large males. And so what we found is that the model is sort of uncovering these trade-offs between management alternatives. And so this just gives information to people making decisions about what's important to them, how they see these trade-offs play out. And so in conclusion, we developed this model, which can be used as a tool to continue evaluating threats in Puget Sound for this fishery. We demonstrated that the model is most sensitive to threats that are removing large males and not so much to the threats that are impacting sublegal males and females. And then we highlighted trade-offs between management strategy alternatives, which essentially is just giving information to decision makers about how to proceed with this fishery. So this should be an ongoing conversation where we continue to update the model to make sure it's reflecting threats that are a priority to folks involved in management, and then see if there's any other management alternatives they'd like to explore. So to answer my friend Krista's question at the beginning of this, we've learned a little bit more about fish in the nearshore and crab. And so overall in my dissertation, I used these observational studies, the lit review, and interviews to understand these ecological processes and how they feed into management decisions. And this work overall is showing that these interactions are complex and we can't necessarily just say shoreline armor is bad for everyone all the time. It's a more nuanced conversation, and it likely means that we should use multiple lines of evidence to think about how habitat might be affecting nearshore fish. And with crab, there's just more to consider about the threats that they face and how we can continue asking questions to support management. And so with that, I'd like to thank my funding sources that have supported me the last 5 years. Thank you to my committee for your support and mentorship through this time and incredible feedback on all of my writing. I want to shout out to a research project that I got to be involved in over the last few years that wasn't part of my dissertation, but this was diving on the Olympic coast that my committee member Javiel invited me to go out on. That was just such a highlight and such a big part of my education. I want to shout out what I consider to be the 3 pillars of my mental health. My cat Smokey, who helped me with a lot of these analyses. My husband Simon, who's been supporting me for over a decade in my school. And also Julia Indivero. And shout out to Miranda for taking my calls. It's no secret that the grad student community is such a big part of what makes this program special. So thank you to all my friends and all the relationships we've built. It means the world to me. Big thanks to all my friends outside of grad school who have really helped keep me sane, even though that didn't always work over the past few years, but it's really great to have that community as well. And big thanks to my family who have been supporting me for many years, my biggest cheerleaders ever since I was a little kid obsessed with Free Willy. So with that, I'd love to take your questions.
So as usual, we'll have questions from the audience. We'll ask the committee to hold their questions. And then Brandon, you'll look at the online questions. Great. Okay, we'll open it up to Q&A.
Hans?
Did you when you looked at the salmon, did you differentiate between marked and unmarked fish in terms of the impact from shoreline?
We did collect data. We didn't always have our CWT reader on the boat, but we did look at if they were clipped or unclipped. I don't think we had a big enough sample size to include it in the models, unfortunately. And also it was very site dependent. So yeah, it would be something to look at. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Follow up on that work. I guess what I took away from that, what we've seen in the projects that we've done, is that fish respond well to changes in connectivity in terms of restoration actions, but maybe not so much. And by fish, I'm talking about salmon. Not so much so clearly to kind of the shoreline projects that sometimes are the easiest to do in terms of their scale. And
Mhm.
they have that kind of combined effect of restoring habitat, that helps process these along, which I think is sort of what you were saying.
Mhm.
These are not things that we should not do, but if you're really gonna try and measure and affect salmon, it's gotta have like a connectivity aspect to it, because
Mhm.
these fish are moving through the shoreline.
Yes.
Is that kind of the
Yeah.
right takeaway?
Definitely. Yeah. Yep. Abigail.
Emily, was really great. So in your third chapter, it looks like the main outcome you were looking at in your model is like how much legal catch are you able to retain in the system, but there's a little bit of a hint at the end
Mm-hmm.
that maybe there are other things to care about, like how many large males are left in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Did you learn from your interviews about any other sort of outcomes that managers care a lot about that might not be reflected in just how much legal catch is there?
Yeah. That is a great question, and I'll repeat it for the people on Zoom. The question was, I was just looking at legal catch in the crab chapter, and were there other things that came out in interviews that managers care about? Thank you for asking that question. That was a slide that I deleted because I was running out of time. So I don't know if I could quickly find it, but no. So the answer is yes. There's more things that people care about than legal catch. And the big ones that I explored in the current model was legal catch, variability in catch, because it's nice to have predictability year to year of how many crab you're going to be able to get. Opportunity to fish throughout the year. So it's important for recreational fishers that want to go out in the winter with their kids, and also important, particularly for tribal communities, having crab for ceremonies throughout the year. And then another one was that one I hinted at, which was leaving some crab in the system, just culturally and spiritually, like let's just not take all of the ones we can. Let's leave some for the ecosystem. Yeah. Lena.
So much, Emily. I'm in your lab and I still learn so much from your presentation. I'm so impressed by how you've done field work. You've done social science methods that I left the lab by the time you started those, and somehow you've already completed that. And then really thoughtful and extremely complex quantitative methods too. I wanted to ask for the first 3 chapters where you weren't specifically doing that kind of interview work and more policy related work. What would your more policy related advice be to managers in this area related to shoreline? Because you've uncovered a lot of nuance, and I know from you know this region so well, and you know a lot of conversations people are having about management. So yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about like what would you communicate about that nuance for what people should change about restoration?
Thank you. Yeah, to repeat the question, it was about if I had to maybe give advice to restoration practitioners in the region, how would I communicate some of the nuance of what we found? I think that I would say if you are focusing on intertidal habitat, armor removal is still great because there's a lot of evidence showing a really strong response of armor removal. If you're focusing more on fish, there isn't that strong response. And so I think maybe the conservative thing to do would be to just maintain heterogeneity of habitats. So basically say, let's have lots of different options for fish to distribute. We may or may not be able to detect that response, but let's just give the option for different traits to come in and use different kinds of habitats. So maybe have a little bit of armor next to a little bit of natural next to a little bit of armor, because I don't think we're going to be able to remove all the armor, especially with sea level rise, and folks like to maintain their property and not see it eroded. And this is also acknowledging that this science is just one piece of decisions about where we conduct restoration, because it also depends on funding and social aspects. So there's a lot to consider, but Yeah, in summary, to answer your question, I would say support different habitat as much as possible instead of just a homogeneous shoreline. No. Thanks, online people.
Okay, well, with that, why don't we remember also give them a okay, how about we just adjourn in like 5? Sound good? Great. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.